The first sound came just after midnight, a deep, mechanical rumbling that shook Private Thomas Larson from troubled sleep. He bolted upright on his cot in the guard tower of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, ears straining in the humid summer darkness. The rhythmic clanking grew louder, unmistakable to anyone who had served in Europe. Tank treads on pavement. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle as his mind raced through impossibilities. German Panzers in Mississippi? Thousands of miles from the front? Sweat beaded on his forehead as he peered into the night. The moon hung low over the pine trees surrounding the camp, where 4,000 German prisoners of war slept behind barbed wire. The rumbling grew louder, more distinct, the grinding, mechanical symphony of heavy armor on the move. Other guards were stirring now, confused voices calling across the compound. "Tank column, east perimeter," someone shouted, and for a heartbeat, the absurd seemed possible. Had prisoners somehow contacted a U-boat? Had German forces made an impossible journey to American soil? In the disorienting fog between sleep and alertness, the sound seemed to herald the collapse of everything secure and certain. Lieutenant Ellis raced across the yard, pistol drawn, barking orders to the night patrol. Searchlights swept across the empty parade ground, catching nothing but dust motes in their beams. The tank noise continued, rhythmic and relentless, but no steel monsters appeared in the light. What could explain this phantom Panzer division rolling through the Mississippi night? What happens when the certainties of war, who is where, what is possible, what is real, suddenly dissolve in the darkness? For the guards at Camp Shelby that summer night in 1944, this question would unfold in ways none could have anticipated, beginning a strange chapter in America's hidden wartime history. The source of the mechanical rumbling emerged 30 minutes later when guards traced the sound to Barrack 17. Inside, they found 2 German prisoners hunched over a record player, faces illuminated by a single bulb. On the turntable spun a heavy shellac disc, its grooves carrying the recorded sounds of German panzer divisions on maneuvers. The men looked up with expressions of both defiance and fear as the American guards burst in, weapons ready. Corporal Dieter Müller, 26, from Frankfurt, and Private Hans Werner, 19, from Dresden, had been playing the record repeatedly, amplifying it through a crude system of pipes and metal sheets that channeled the sound toward the guard towers. Their fellow prisoners lay in their bunks, some smirking, others looking apprehensive. The record itself had come in a care package from the International Red Cross, innocuously labeled as military band music. "What were you thinking?" Lieutenant Ellis demanded through an interpreter, his face flushed with anger and lingering adrenaline. Müller maintained a stiff posture, eyes fixed forward. "We wanted to remind you that Germany still fights," he answered in broken English, "that we are still soldiers." The guards confiscated the record player and escorted both men to the camp's detention cells. By morning, the incident had been logged as a minor disciplinary issue, a prank, essentially, but something about it continued to trouble Thomas Larson. As he finished his night shift and walked back to his quarters under the pink dawn sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that the episode revealed something significant about the psychological reality of captivity. For the prisoners, the auditory illusion had briefly transformed the power dynamic. For one disorienting half hour, they had made their captors feel vulnerable on American soil, something the Nazi propaganda machine had promised but never delivered. The record had given them a taste of the impossible, a momentary reversal that must have been intoxicating for men who had lost everything, including their identity as German warriors. But the illusion had another effect, one that would ripple through the camp in unexpected ways over the coming weeks. It made the Americans realize just how deeply the sounds of war remained etched in everyone's consciousness, ready to trigger primal fear with the slightest provocation. How strange that a simple phonograph record could dissolve the boundaries between Mississippi and the Western Front, between safety and danger, between victory and defeat. The record player incident might have faded into camp lore if not for what happened 3 days later when Captain Richard Harmon, the camp's executive officer, made a decision that bewildered both guards and prisoners. Instead of extending the punishment for Mueller and Werner, he ordered their release from detention with an unusual stipulation. They would help establish a camp music program under strict supervision. These men need structure, Harmon explained to his skeptical staff. They need something constructive to do with their minds and hands. Music might be that thing. A veteran of the North African campaign, Harmon had seen firsthand how quickly prisoner morale could deteriorate into violence or despair without proper outlets. The record player incident had given him an idea. Thomas Larson was assigned to oversee the new program, a duty he initially resented. At 24, with a brother fighting in Italy, supervising German prisoners' recreational activities felt dangerously close to coddling the enemy. "With all due respect, sir, these men tried to terrify us," he reminded Captain Harmon. "Now we're rewarding them with music lessons?" Harmon fixed him with a steady gaze. "We're not at war with civilization itself, Private Larson. These men are out of the fight. Our job is to keep them secure, yes, but also to remember they're human beings." He paused, then added quietly, "Besides, I'd rather have them playing instruments than plotting escapes or worse." The camp's modest collection of musical instruments, a battered piano in the recreation hall, a few guitars, a set of drums, some brass instruments donated by a local high school, was supplemented by harmonicas and accordions from Red Cross packages. Under guard supervision, Mueller and Werner began organizing interested prisoners into small ensembles. What surprised Larson most was how quickly the Germans took to the program. Men who had stood stiff and hostile during morning roll call transformed when they held instruments. A former Wehrmacht artillery officer revealed himself to be an accomplished violinist. A U-boat radio man played clarinet with delicate precision. Faces that had seemed permanently set in grim lines softened when the music began. "It reminds me of home," confessed Werner one afternoon as he tuned a guitar. "Before everything, before the war." For a moment, his youthful features shed their hardness, and Larson glimpsed the civilian beneath the soldier. Barely more than a boy who had probably been drafted straight from school into Hitler's war machine. But what neither the guards nor the camp administration anticipated was how the music program would gradually alter the psychological landscape of Camp Shelby itself, beginning a subtle transformation that would challenge everyone's assumptions about captivity, humanity, and the invisible boundaries that separate enemies in wartime. Within 2 weeks, the camp had 3 distinct musical groups. A classical ensemble led by Lieutenant Karl Brenner, a former Munich Philharmonic violinist, a folk group that specialized in traditional German lieder, and a jazz band that practiced American swing music with surprising enthusiasm. This last group particularly fascinated Larson, as it contradicted everything he'd been told about Nazi cultural policies. "Isn't jazz forbidden in Germany?" he asked Ernst Hoffmann, a saxophonist from Hamburg who had worked in nightclubs before the war. Hoffmann glanced around before answering in a low voice. "Officially, yes. Degenerate Negro music, they called it. But underground, in certain clubs, we still played. Music doesn't care about politics." He smiled slightly. "Hitler hates jazz. That's reason enough to love it, no?" This glimpse into the complexity of German society, the gap between official Nazi doctrine and private lives, unsettled Larson's neat categories of enemy and ally. These men had fought for a regime that burned books and banned music, yet here they were, finding solace in the very art their leaders had condemned. Captain Harmon observed the changes with quiet satisfaction. Disciplinary incidents decreased by 30% in the first month of the music program. The atmosphere in the mess hall grew less tense. Even the most ardent Nazi supporters among the prisoners seemed affected by the gradual softening of the environment, though some still refused to participate directly. "Music reaches parts of us that ideology can't touch," Harmon remarked to Larson one evening as they listened to the classical ensemble rehearse a Beethoven quartet. "It reminds us of what we share, not what divides us." The statement hung in the air, challenging everything the war had taught them about the unbridgeable gulf between Americans and Germans. Yet even as bridges formed through shared musical experiences, echoes of the conflict that had brought them all to this strange circumstance in Mississippi persisted. Reminders that reconciliation would require more than mere appreciation of Bach or Gershwin. The war still raged across the ocean, and its shadow stretched long across Camp Shelby's grounds. As July gave way to August, something unexpected began to take shape within the confines of Camp Shelby. What had started as a disciplinary measure had evolved into a genuine cultural exchange. The American Guards found themselves lingering after their shifts, drawn by the music flowing from the recreation hall. Local musicians from Hattiesburg occasionally visited, bringing instruments, sheet music, and curiosity about the prisoners' ensembles. Sergeant Frank Whitaker, a jazz trumpeter from New Orleans who supervised the camp kitchen, began informal jam sessions with Hoffman and 3 other German prisoners who had embraced American swing music. Their Sunday afternoon performances drew growing crowds of both prisoners and guards, creating a temporary neutral zone where uniforms and ranks seemed less significant. "I never thought I'd be playing Moonlight Serenade with a bunch of Germans," Whitaker confessed to Larson. "My brother's fighting these people in France right now." He shook his head, bewildered by the contradiction. War makes no damn sense sometimes. For Thomas Larson, the transformation was equally disorienting. The men whose phantom Panzer record had spiked his adrenaline now nodded respectfully when he entered the barracks. Dieter Müller, once sullen and confrontational, had discovered a talent for arrangement, adapting American songs for the German musicians with creative flourishes that impressed even the professional musicians among the guards. "He could have a career in music after the war," remarked Lieutenant Ellis, the same officer who had dragged Müller to detention just weeks earlier. The casual mention of a future beyond conflict, a time when these men would return to civilian life, struck Larson with unexpected force. He had been thinking of the prisoners as permanent enemies, frozen in their wartime identity. The possibility of their eventual return to normal society seemed suddenly, strangely poignant. Captain Heinrich Goethe, the highest-ranking German officer in the camp, observed the musical activities with initial skepticism that gradually gave way to cautious support. A decorated Luftwaffe commander shot down over North Africa, Goethe maintained rigid military discipline among the prisoners, but recognized the value of the program for morale. "Music is mathematics made beautiful," he told Larson during an inspection of the recreation hall. "It requires order, precision, harmony, qualities that soldiers understand." His English was impeccable, his bearing aristocratic. "In this, perhaps, we are not so different from Americans." Even the most dedicated Nazi sympathizers among the prisoners found it difficult to maintain their ideological fervor in the face of shared musical experiences. When the classical ensemble performed Mendelssohn, a composer banned in Germany due to his Jewish heritage, several guards noticed tears in the eyes of men who had once proudly displayed swastika tattoos. Yet these moments of connection remained fraught with complexity. During one rehearsal, a prisoner named Werner Keller suddenly smashed his violin against the wall and stormed out, shouting in German. Later, an interpreter explained that the melody had reminded him of his wife and children in Dresden, a city he feared would be bombed before he could return home. "They're still our enemies," Lieutenant Ellis reminded the guards during a staff meeting. "Don't mistake musical ability for political conversion." The warning was necessary. Several guards had begun bringing cigarettes and extra rations to their favorite musicians, blurring professional boundaries in ways that concerned camp leadership. In this strange emotional territory between enmity and understanding, the men of Camp Shelby, prisoners and guards alike, navigated a relationship that military training had never prepared them for. Could music truly build bridges across the chasm of war? Or was this merely a temporary illusion, a pleasant interlude, before reality reasserted itself? By mid-September, the camp's musical groups had reached a level of proficiency that surprised everyone involved. Captain Harmon, sensing an opportunity to showcase the program's success, proposed something unprecedented: a formal concert open to military personnel from nearby bases and select members of the Hattiesburg community. The suggestion met resistance from several quarters. "These aren't performing monkeys," objected Sergeant Whitaker, "and they're not propaganda tools either." His concern reflected a growing protective attitude among guards involved with the music program. They worried about putting the prisoners on display as curiosities or examples of American humane treatment, concerns the prisoners themselves shared. Lieutenant Brenner, the former Munich violinist now leading the classical ensemble, expressed his own reservations through an interpreter. "We are not ashamed of our music," he explained carefully. "But we do not wish to be exhibited as specimens of the defeated enemy." Captain Harmon listened to these concerns with characteristic patience. "This isn't about propaganda," he assured them. "It's about recognizing that art transcends conflict. If music can remind us all of our common humanity, especially now, isn't that worth sharing?" After much debate, a compromise was reached. The concert would proceed with minimal publicity, framed as a cultural exchange rather than a display of captives. The German musicians would choose their own repertoire, and attendance would be strictly voluntary for all prisoners. Most importantly, no photographs would be permitted. As preparations intensified, Thomas Larsen noticed a transformation in the camp's atmosphere. Prisoners not directly involved in the music program began offering help, crafting music stands from scrap wood, sewing uniform modifications to create more formal attire for the performers, even designing programs in careful calligraphy. The concert had become a collective project that gave purpose to men who had been drifting in the limbo of captivity. "It gives us back something we lost," explained Hans Werner, the young Dresdener who had helped play the tank record months earlier. He gestured vaguely at the camp around them. Not freedom, but, he searched for the English word, dignity, perhaps. The night before the concert, Larsen discovered Dieter Müller alone in the recreation hall, hunched over pages of sheet music. The German looked up, dark circles under his eyes, testifying to sleepless nights of preparation. "Why did you do it?" Larsen asked suddenly. "The record player trick." "It seems so long ago now." Müller considered the question, his fingers absently tracing notes on the page. "To feel powerful again, for just a moment," he finally answered, "to remind ourselves we were soldiers, not just prisoners." He shook his head slowly. "But now I understand. This music we create together, it gives more power than that childish trick, real power." As Müller returned to his work, Larsen wondered, how many other discoveries awaited these men, on both sides, as they continued this unexpected journey together? And how would these experiences reshape their understanding of enemy, ally, and the artificial boundaries drawn by war? October 15th, 1944. The day of the concert arrived with an almost ceremonial weight. The recreation hall had been transformed. Rows of folding chairs arranged before a makeshift stage, windows polished, floors swept. Die Ensembles warteten nervös in adjazenten Räumen, Tuning-Instrumente und strähten die spezielle Uniformjacken, die sie bemerkte modifizieren für die Occasion hatten. Außerhalb Militärfahrzeuge deliverte Gäste von Camp Van Dorn und Keesler Field. Lokale Zivilen, meist Musiklehrer, Church-Choir-Direktoren und Member von Hattiesburgs Kleinsymphonie erreichten in modeste Sedans. Alle Visitors surrenderte Kameras an der Eintrag und erhielten careful Instruktionen über Interaktion mit den Prisonern. Thomas Larsen stand näher der Door, Watschen die Hall füllen mit einem unwahrscheinlichen Audienz. Amerikanische Militärpersonell und Zivilen, geteilt zu hören German Prisoners of War performen. Der surreale Nature der Situation strak ihm mit fresher Force. Diese waren dieselben Männer, die had played Phantom Panzer Sounds zu terrorisieren Guards just months earlier. Nun würden sie Beethoven und Glenn Miller führen, für dieselben Guards und der Gäste. At precisely 7 o'clock, Captain Harmon stepped onto the stage to welcome the audience. His brief remarks emphasized the universal language of music and acknowledged the unusual circumstances bringing them together. Today, we set aside the conflict that divides our nations to recognize what we share as human beings, he concluded.
In doing so, perhaps we glimpse what peace might someday feel like. The classical ensemble performed first, 20 prisoners in pressed uniforms executing Mozart and Beethoven with precision born of weeks of disciplined practice. Lieutenant Brenner's violin soared above the makeshift orchestra, his face transformed by concentration and passion. The audience sat motionless, some with eyes closed, others watching in visible amazement at the technical skill displayed by men they had been taught to see only as enemies.
When the final notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faded, silence held for 3 heartbeats before applause erupted, tentative at first, then building to genuine enthusiasm. Brenner bowed stiffly, military bearing reasserting itself, but his eyes revealed emotion he couldn't fully contain. The folk ensemble followed with traditional German lieder, songs of forests, rivers, and village life that predated Nazism by centuries. Their harmonies evoked a Germany beyond politics and war, a cultural heritage older and more enduring than any regime. Several elderly audience members with German surnames wiped away tears, hearing melodies from childhood, sung in a language many had stopped speaking publicly after America entered the war. During intermission, Larsen overheard fragments of conversation that reflected the audience's conflicted responses. A young lieutenant from Keesler Field remarked, "Hard to believe these are the same people bombing London." Nearby, an older woman whispered, "They're someone's sons, just like our boys over there." The simple observation carried profound weight in that moment. The jazz ensemble concluded the program, opening with Sing, 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 in an arrangement that featured Ernst Hoffmann's saxophone in place of Benny Goodman's clarinet. The German prisoners playing American swing music, music officially condemned by the Nazi regime, created a cognitive dissonance that wasn't lost on anyone present. When Sergeant Whitaker joined them on stage for St. James Infirmary Blues, the boundary between captors and captives blurred even further. As the final notes echoed through the hall, the audience rose in standing ovation. The German musicians stood at attention, acknowledging the response with formal bows rather than the relaxed waves American performers might have offered.
Even in this moment of artistic triumph, they remained soldiers, prisoners, men defined by a conflict larger than themselves. Captain Harmon invited several guests to meet the musicians afterward, creating controlled interactions that Lieutenant Ellis monitored carefully. A music teacher from Hattiesburg spoke with Brenner about violin technique. The conductor of the local Methodist church choir discussed vocal arrangements with the folk ensemble's leader. These conversations, halting and awkward at first, gradually found rhythm in shared musical vocabulary. Watching these exchanges, Thomas Larsen experienced a revelation that would stay with him long after the war ended. Music had not erased the reality of conflict, but it had created a space where human connection could exist alongside it. The Germans were still prisoners, the Americans still their captors. The war still raged across the Atlantic. But for a few hours, other truths had been acknowledged too, that culture transcends borders, that art reveals our common humanity, that even enemies can recognize beauty together. As the visitors departed and prisoners returned to their barracks, the night air filled with something subtly different from the tension that usually blanketed the camp after dark. Larsen couldn't name it precisely, not friendship, certainly not reconciliation, but perhaps a kind of recognition. They had seen each other as something more than uniform and rank, more than victor and vanquished. Later that night, walking his guard route under a canopy of Mississippi stars, Larsen paused near Barracks 17, where the Phantom Panzer record had once played. Through the window came the soft sound of a harmonica, a melancholy tune he didn't recognize, but felt somewhere beneath his ribs. The music spoke of homesickness, of lives interrupted, of uncertainty. It reminded him that for all their differences, everyone at Camp Shelby shared one fundamental condition. They were all waiting for the war to end, for life to resume its natural course. What would these men, Americans and Germans alike, carry forward from these strange intersections of music and conflict? Would the prisoners return to a devastated Germany with new perspectives on their former enemies? Would the guards remember these moments of connection when victory finally came? These questions had no immediate answers, but they hung in the air alongside the harmonica's plaintive notes, suggesting possibilities beyond the rigid categories of war.
The concert at Camp Shelby became something of a legend, rippling outward through military circles and eventually reaching the War Department in Washington. Reports crossed the desk of officials concerned with prisoner treatment, morale, and the delicate balance between security and humanity in handling enemy captives. The success prompted consideration of similar programs at other POW camps across America. Captain Harmon received a commendation for innovative approach to prisoner management, though some senior officers questioned whether such fraternization might undermine the military discipline necessary in detention facilities. The debate reflected America's broader uncertainty about how to view German prisoners, as irredeemable Nazis or as potential converts to democratic values, as threats to be contained or as future allies to be cultivated. For the prisoners themselves, the aftermath brought both rewards and complications. Their improved status within the camp created resentments among those who saw the musicians as collaborators. A small faction of hardcore Nazi supporters began a whisper campaign, suggesting that participation in American-sanctioned activities constituted betrayal of the fatherland. One morning, Ernst Hoffmann found a crude drawing of a hanged man outside his bunk, a warning of what collaborators could expect when Germany ultimately triumphed. Though he reported the threat to the guards, he declined protection, telling Sergeant Whitaker, "These are my countrymen. I must find my own way with them." The music program continued despite these tensions, expanding to include weekly performances in the mess hall and special concerts for religious holidays. As 1944 drew to a close and news from Europe increasingly foretold Germany's defeat, the melodies flowing through Camp Shelby took on more complex emotional resonances: nostalgia, grief, cautious hope for an uncertain future. For Thomas Larson, the experience transformed his understanding of what military service could encompass. He had enlisted expecting to fight an enemy he understood only through propaganda and newsreels. Instead, he found himself engaged in a different kind of struggle, the complicated work of seeing humanity in those designated as enemies while still maintaining the boundaries necessary in wartime. "I still believe in why we're fighting," he wrote to his brother in Italy that December. "But I've learned that the men on the other side aren't just uniforms or ideologies. They're people with the same fears and hopes we have, caught in something bigger than any of us." He hesitated before adding, "They make beautiful music, John. I wish you could hear it." As Christmas approached, Captain Harmon approved a special holiday concert with a combined choir of prisoners and guards, performing traditional carols in both German and English. The rehearsals for this unprecedented collaboration revealed how far they had all traveled since that summer night when phantom Panzer sounds had shattered the Mississippi darkness. Dieter Müller and Hans Werner, the two prisoners whose record player prank had started everything, now worked alongside Thomas Larson to arrange Silent Night for the combined choir, a song written by an Austrian, beloved by Germans and Americans alike, that spoke of peace in a world torn by war. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. "Did you ever imagine this when you played that tank record?" Larson asked Werner during a rehearsal break. The young German smiled faintly. "Never," he admitted. "I thought only of frightening you, of feeling strong again for a moment." He gestured toward the music stands, the gathered singers, the instruments waiting nearby. "This is different strength, better strength." As the choir's voices rose together, German and English verses alternating, then merging in harmony, something crystallized in that moment that transcended the temporal circumstances of captivity and war. It wasn't peace exactly. The conflict still raged an ocean away. Men still died daily on both sides, and these prisoners remained far from home behind barbed wire. But it was a glimpse of possibility, a reminder that beneath the artificially constructed categories of enemy and ally lay a more fundamental human capacity for connection. The phantom Panzer division that had once rolled through the Mississippi night existed only in grooves on a shellac disc, an illusion deployed by desperate men seeking to reclaim lost power. But the music that now filled Camp Shelby was real, tangible, immediate, alive with genuine emotion and shared experience. It created no illusions, but instead revealed truths normally hidden by the fog of war. That culture endures even in captivity.
that art can bridge divides that weapons create, that humanity persists even in humanity's darkest hours. Years later, long after the war had ended and the prisoners had returned to a rebuilt Germany, Thomas Larsen would remember that Christmas concert as the moment when he understood something essential about conflict and reconciliation. Music didn't end the war, he would tell his grandchildren, but it reminded us what peace might sound like. Perhaps that reminder, that gentle insistence on our capacity for harmony, even amid discord, is the most powerful legacy of that strange chapter when phantom tanks became real music, when enemies became musicians, when the impossible briefly became possible in a prisoner of war camp deep in the American South. In the quieter moments of our lives, if we listen carefully, we might still hear its echoes today.